This is episode 274 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Patrons get to contribute directly to programming, tell us what they'd like to hear about in an episode, and ask questions directly to our guests, along with a library of bonus episodes not available on public listening platforms. Find all of these things at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife.
Hi. I'm Duncan Phillips, fine art and antiques researcher and writer. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
But it always finished with the spectacle of a monkey being tied to the back of an old horse, and then the dogs being let loose on the horse, and the monkey was screaming in fear as the dogs ripped the horse to shreds underneath it.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When it comes to stepping back into the life of William Shakespeare and walking around the streets of London to see what the sights, sounds, smells, people, and places were really like, no one does that better than a time traveler. In order to take just such a trip and take a short jaunt down a London street during the 16th century, we're delighted to welcome a man who is a listener favorite and a longtime listener requested guest, the history time traveler himself and author of The Time Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England. Ian Mortimer is here to take us back to London the way Shakespeare would have lived it. Dr. Ian Mortimer is best known as the Sunday Times best-selling author of the 4 Time Traveler's Guides to Medieval England, Elizabethan England, Restoration Britain, and Regency Britain, as well as 4 critically acclaimed medieval biographies, a prize-winning novel, and several other titles. In total, his books have sold more than 1.3 million copies and been translated into 16 languages. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. His work on the social history of medicine won the Alexander Prize in 2004 and was published by the Royal Historical Society in 2009. He's been described by the Times as the most remarkable medieval historian of our time. You can find out more about Ian and links to his work in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Ian. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
One of the things I believe we would have been most surprised as a modern person to see if we were walking down the streets of London during Shakespeare's lifetime would have been public punishments. Ian, can you share with us what kinds of punishments happened in the streets of London and whether these were considered public spectacles? I mean, would they have sold tickets to this kind of event?
They wouldn't have sold tickets, but you'd have seen a whole range of different punishments, going from really the quite macabre to the just plain vicious. Death penalties. We've got to remember the death penalty was seen as a deterrent, and deterrence was the main way in which people thought they could prevent crime. And therefore, the death penalty was carried out very much in public, whether that was for treason, in which case hanging and withdrawing and quartering was a public spectacle. And in the case of women, hanging and then burning to death, actually, in the case of women. So burning people alive, that you could see that. You could see burning alive in the case of people being executed for heresy, because although we no longer burn Catholics, or although Catholics no longer burn Protestants, you do still have Anabaptists being burnt alive in Elizabethan London. You'd have seen hanging for theft. You'd have seen women being burnt for petty treason, so murdering their husbands or murdering their employer. You'd have seen important people being beheaded. So all sorts of capital punishments would have been public spectacles, and there'd have been crowds, absolute crowds, attending these, especially if they're important people. Further down the ranks of society and the levels of crime, you'd have come across people being put to the pillory, which is the wooden board which holds your head and hands. And we see them at sort of heritage sites done as a bit of a joke, children playing or putting their heads in the pillory, but they're nothing like a joke. You have your ears nailed to the board, and when they cut you out, they cut your ears off. People throw things at you while you're in the pillory. Pillories can be fatal when people are having glass bottles thrown at them and things like that. So they are really no joke at all. That might happen for something like sedition or selling bad products, in the case of selling bad fish or something like that. Probably the most common punishment you'd see enacted in the streets, I imagine, would be a whipping. Vagabonds were whipped, so people who were homeless were whipped out of town. Petty thieves were whipped. So this normally involves men and women being stripped half naked and tied to the back of a cart and dragged through the town while being whipped. Sometimes people were tied to a whipping post and whipped. There's an instance I recall, which is in Time Traveller's Elizabethan book, where I think it was a schoolmaster, whipped a boy so much that the skin came off his back. And this was thought to be a cruel and unusual punishment. So the schoolmaster himself was tied to a whipping post and the skin was lashed off his back. So you do find a lot of public punishments. And I suppose the last one I want to mention is the cucking stool, which in some places is a ducking stool, where women scolds were dipped into water as a punishment. But also in some towns you'd have seen them carried around on a stool or just placed in a stool of shame for being a scold. Or some other one of the things I do remember was that there was a woman who sold a child into prostitution, and she ended up in the cucking stool as a result. So yes, you see a lot of public punishment, but the purpose is not for entertaining people, so no tickets are being sold. The purpose is to threaten everybody that this will happen to you if you do not obey the law.
In his book, The Time Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England, Ian talks about bathing, specifically saying that there's more ways than soap and water to get clean. That was surprising to me, as that's the go-to method I would think of for cleaning anything. So, Ian, What were some of the ways Elizabethan England used to keep clean?
You've got to bear in mind a backdrop to this of water and what water means to people, because we presume that water is itself clean. In Elizabethan times, you could not presume that. They had a whole scale of cleanliness to water. So the cleanest water is that falls from heaven onto the roof of your house and you collect it yourself. That's the cleanest water you're going to get. So second to that would be spring water that you own yourself, and you actually control the means by which the spring water comes to you. As you go down the pecking order, obviously spring water at a distance, and then there's well water, and very lowest of all is river water. And river water you really don't want to have anything to do with, because it's where everybody throws their effluent and their meat scraps and things like that. So you do not want to take anything out of the river. So when you've got this whole scale of water, the clean stuff is expensive. And actually having water brought to you in a town can be very expensive. So if you're less well off, you won't use water to wash with. You will use what most people use, which is linen. Now, linen acts as a means of cleaning in various ways. They're normally called rubbers. You have two warmed linen towels, and you might use those for cleaning your hair. Most women would use them for cleaning their hair, although they might use lye as well, washing your hair in lye and then using rubbers. But rubbers are used to clean the skin because there's no water involved. That once you've got the linen, it obviously doesn't cost you anything. Just cleaning the linen is the thing. And it soaks up sweat, it removes grime. And so basically rubbing the body with linen rubbers is the most common way people will wash. At the top of society, people do bathe a lot. I mean, the Queen does go around with a bathtub in her carriage when she's on her progresses. But most people are very wary of immersing their body in water because of the infections that get into the skin through immersion. So, linens is probably the most common. Then it becomes a matter of cleaning the cloth. And that is why the role of washing linen becomes so important. And people use urine as part of the cloth cleaning process. All sorts of unsurprising things go into the process of cleaning cloth. But ultimately, it's a matter of linen. Yeah, gentlemen would wear clean shirts sometimes 3 or 4 times a day to stay clean, to rinse their body by the abrasion of linen on their skin.
It's not really unlike what we think of dry brushing, is what they call it today, with a brush, to brush your skin with a dry brush. Similar method.
I mean, the brushing becomes much more common, and actually brushes are used Beau Brummel in the next century, 2 centuries on from this, does use brushes, pig bristle brushes, that's right, to clean himself. But that I haven't come across in Elizabethan times.
Speaking of sanitation, Ian writes about the medical profession of Elizabethan England, saying that they really were on par with modern surgeons in terms of their skill, but it was a lack of knowledge around infection and bacteria that made medicine dangerous for Shakespeare's lifetime. Ian, share with us some examples of medical procedures we know of from the Elizabethan period that are just as skillfully done then as now, and then explain why bacteria made some of this skill ultimately futile in the medical profession.
I wouldn't say that on a par. I think that's a little bit of exaggeration because we have so much more knowledge and tuition now for surgery. But you've got to bear in mind that there's a lot of violence in Elizabethan England, and the violence led to a lot of surgeons having a lot of first-hand experience of how to operate. What would they do then that is extremely skillful that we would have difficulty saying was bad practice today? Removing bullets, removing arrowheads, especially when an arrowhead had been broken off. So they may well use instruments that go into the wound following the path of the arrow and then screw to release an expanding mechanism to pull the arrowhead out without actually damaging the body. In some cases, if they identify the shape of the arrow in the wound, they might knock it all the way through so it actually comes out the other side, because the barbs would actually do too much damage otherwise. So there are a number of sort of wound-based surgical processes that may well be, we would be quite impressed by the skill with which they could do them. The stitching up of wounds, obviously, is something that people had a great deal of skill with. Amputation, I think, is probably up there as well, because how do you amputate when you don't have modern painkillers? They, obviously, if they're very, very fast, they could take advantage of the body's own endorphins to act as painkillers, but still it's going to be extremely painful if you're cutting somebody's leg off. You've got to cut through all the skin, cut through all the flesh, get to the bone, and then saw through the bone. And sawing through the bone takes a lot of time. So what you're going to use, they do have opiates. They could use opiate painkillers. And of course, if you couldn't get hold of opiates or couldn't afford opiates, then you may well use alcohol. And by Elizabethan times, you do have distilled alcohol. So it wasn't just a case of drinking a lot of wine. You could probably get something stronger to operate. But yeah, I don't think I'd have liked to undergo any of these particular operations. You can see they are all high risk when it comes to bacteria getting into the bloodstream. So despite their skill, it really was going to be futile in a lot of cases.
I'm with you. It's a really great reason to stay safe, almost like to paranoid levels. Don't do anything dangerous.
Yeah.
Of course, we have to talk about Elizabethan entertainment and going to the theater when we're talking about what was going on in London during Shakespeare's lifetime. And I wonder specifically, if we walk down a street in Elizabethan London, how many theaters would there have been? I mean, we talk about the Globe, but there was certainly several of them. And what were the sights and sounds associated with these kinds of locations?
Yeah, there were several theatres in London, none outside London as far as I know. But in London, yes, you had the Globe, you had the theatre, you had the Curtain, you had the Red Lion originally. That's the first purpose-built theatre. But in addition to these, and across the country, you'd have had inns. If you think about an Elizabethan theatre with its galleries, well, those galleries are really an adaptation of an inn gallery. If you happen to go to the New Inn in Gloucester, there is a medieval inn there which survives with its gallery intact all the way round. So on 4 sides, you have at first floor a gallery overlooking the central courtyard. And that is really where the sort of place where actors would have started to ply their trade in the mid-16th century. The secular theatre really begins to be performed in inns. Some additions to that, the noblemen's companies obviously acted in palaces and stately homes. The purpose-built theatres, I think probably 4, 5, 6 of them maybe at once in London, no more than that. And of course, once Puritanism comes in the next century, then you in the 1600s, then you very quickly see the number of theatres drop away. The Globe was converted into apartments at some point. Well, the sights and sounds you'd have associated with them, well, I would imagine that people were in a constant battle to try and keep the audience quiet enough so they could actually hear what was being said on stage. I don't know that. No one actually talks about it very much. But when you have quite cheap entertainment like that, and the what you would normally call cheap seats, but people are actually standing, and they're constantly eating and having conversations, and the theatre was also associated to a degree with prostitution and people trying to hang on to those with money. I think you'd have been struggling to hear all the words, and I think the sound-wise, that there would have been this general sort of babble in the background as people strained to hear the actors' voices, and the actors, of course, strained to project their voices. As for the smells, you'd have had quite a lot of refuse on the floor. Yeah, I just imagine a crowd, and I think that is what you'd associate with the purpose-built theatres.
A rather stinky, loud place to be.
A lot of people gathered together who hadn't had access to a rubber for a little while.
So was going to the theater the only option for public entertainment, or what other kinds of entertainment would have been available for someone that was looking for a fun night out on the town in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, you use the word night there, and that's a key thing, because we also associate entertainment with nighttime because we have artificial lighting. And you've got to remember that very few towns had any public lighting at all, and most buildings were expensive to light. So people looked at their entertainment being a daytime thing. Evenings, the ale house and the tavern were the obvious places to go for entertainment of an evening, and they might include music as well. I mean, there's a reference, I think it's in Thomas Platter's diary, to he couldn't get into a London ale house without somebody playing music at him. A bagpiper by the door was one particular instance he mentions. But yes, you'd have had town waits who are performing music in public. Obviously, the hunting sports. Hurling was a sport that was quite popular in the West Country. Wrestling was popular in the West Country and the North. Football existed as a rough game across the whole country. It was not really approved of. But then you have all the sort of things like the baiting sports. So bear baiting, bull baiting. And bear baiting is quite rare because bears are quite rare in England. But it always finished with the spectacle of a monkey being tied to the back of an old horse, and then the dogs being let loose on the horse. And the monkey was screaming in fear as the dogs ripped the horse to shreds underneath it, which was always thought to be a great spectacle in Elizabethan bear baiting scenarios. I would say that when historical novelists are looking for accuracy, I say, no, what you really need is authenticity, which is impossible to achieve, because I defy you to make your characters likable if they're going on to see a bear baiting in which bears are attacked by dogs and then a horse is killed while a monkey is screaming in panic by dogs. We can't really make that leap to that being entertainment. Bull baiting had to be done by law. You weren't allowed to slaughter a bull without torturing it first. So bull baiting is a very common entertainment. Again, the dogs go at the bull. There are people around with 2 sticks with which they try and break the dog's fall when the bull has tossed them. So all sorts of entertainment along those lines you'd have seen. But yeah, I just stuck to the ale house myself.
It sounds like the safer option among these things. And the bull baiting being required by law, I think, was about tenderizing the meat. That was what they thought was going on.
Yes, in order to deliver good value for money, there was no idea of animal
cruelty concepts at all.
No, that had to wait until 1822 to come in, really.
One of the interesting aspects of Ian's book, among so many, but is how he looks at traveling in Elizabethan England. And I mean traveling like getting from one place to another. Ian, what were the modes of travel available to someone looking to take an excursion in Shakespeare's lifetime? Let's take Shakespeare traveling from Stratford-upon-Avon to London. I always think about him going on foot or possibly by horse, but were there other options?
The other option really is carriage, and carriages did exist, but carriages are largely for women. In this period, in the 17th century, carriages for both sexes equally. But in Elizabethan times, carriages were still associated with women. They were quite a novel phenomenon in Elizabethan times, because in medieval England, carriages did exist. Countesses and wealthy women did have them, but they were extremely expensive. I mean, you could spend £1,000 on a carriage in the 14th century. And then we never really had a culture of road travel like that, because we were still using a Roman road system, 4,000 miles of it, and it wasn't in a very good shape. And so what was the point of having a carriage which simply fall to pieces if you started to use it? Because of the religious hiatus in the 1500s, a number of first Catholic families, then Protestant families, found themselves in exile at various times. And when the Protestants who had fled to Antwerp got to Antwerp, they realised that everybody was travelling around the city in carriages. And when they came back to England in Elizabeth's reign, they brought back the whole idea that the dignified of the community, especially the women, would be carried in a carriage. Men in this country were very resistant to the idea. I mean, Sir William Cecil, the Secretary of State, when he went on a journey with his wife, she went in the carriage because that was the done thing for ladies of her rank, and he rode on a horse behind her. So when I say you could travel in a carriage, it depends what sex you were and how much money you had and which route you were taking, because some routes were simply impassable for carriages and some bridges were impassable for carriages. The majority of those who had money would have ridden a horse. And the reason they would have ridden a horse was not just because they wanted to save their legs or they thought it was good exercise, it's because it was associated with status. So William Shakespeare, who was constantly trying to emphasize his higher status and a real social climber through his desire to become, acquire wealth and status through coats of arms, things like that, he would have ridden as a matter of course, because people would have associated him with a gentleman that way. If he'd been on foot, people would have done the opposite assumption, and they would presume that he was not a gentleman. So I have no doubt in saying you're right in assuming that he rode from Stratford to London, presuming he could afford it at the time. So maybe his first journey was on foot, and when he went back, he went on a horse. The majority of people are going to be travelling on foot, and they are used to travelling very long distances on foot. We might think of 10 miles as being a long walk. They've been quite happy looking at twice that as being a standard day's walk. There's no real maximum to how far they could have walked. And there are a number of feats in later centuries to exceptional long journeys on foot. But it would have been quite regular in the 16th century for people to travel 20 miles on foot when they needed to go somewhere. Take where I live in Devon, in the southwest of England, as an example. The local archdeaconry court to here is in Totnes, which is about 24 miles away. So if I was accused of a moral crime and I needed to go and make my innocence known, I'd have been summoned, and I'd have been summoned to also bring along with me 6, 7, 8 or 9 compurgators who would swear on oath to my innocence or my good behaviour or whichever. So I'd have walked off with all 6, 7, 8 or 9 of them to Totnes, which is 24 miles away. And you could be further away from your archdeaconry court than that. So obviously getting there, you'd have to stay, you'd have to put everybody up, and then for a night and then in, and then come back home again. But yeah, 24 miles a day would have been quite usual to expect people to walk.
I like to think of like large carriages. I don't know if they're called carriages when they're hauling goods instead of people, but like a cart.
Wagons, if they're hauling goods. Yeah.
Yeah. Was there any such thing as like hitchhiking, where if someone was going down the road hauling a cart with hay or some other kind of good in the back, where a traveler would hop on the back with the goods and ride that for a while?
Yeah, the carriers existed, and carriers are very slow, of course. So carriers are normally carrying goods from one place to another, and hitching a lift, I'm sure it happened on many occasions. I don't think it's yet formalized as a process that you see in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the carriers were organized, they were named, they did regular routes, and you could pay to ride with them. They're normally very slow, but if you're not able-bodied, they're better than walking. So I don't think there's any formalization of carriers in Elizabethan times, but there are certainly informal carriers, and certainly the idea of hitching a lift would have been a very common one. But bear in mind, some parts of the country, you wouldn't have had wagons being able to offer such a lift. Where I live here in Devon, we live on Dartmoor Plateau, and there was no wheel transport until the end of the 18th century. The hill's too steep, the ground is too rough, so everybody did everything by horse, and they carried their goods by pack horse. So some parts of the country would have been very much on foot or on horseback.
For people traveling to England from other places in the Elizabethan time period, they would have had to have somewhere to stay. And you mentioned this just a second ago, where if you're going, to court, you have to put everybody up while you're there. I think local inns certainly come to mind as a place that people would stay. But what other options were available to someone that wanted a place to stay temporarily? And what was the general experience like for a traveler visiting London in the 16th century?
Two very different questions there. The options of where to stay. There is still probably the remnants of the medieval idea of hospitality. Inns, there are probably the same number of inns in 1577 when there was a survey made of all the licensed premises in the whole country as there had been a couple of hundred years earlier. We're probably talking about 2,000 inns across the whole country, scattered around the major cities, about 20 cities, and probably about 600 market towns. rural inns would have been quite uncommon. So they're very much a town thing, inns. If you're staying in a rural area, well, you would have perhaps asked to stay with people's private houses. That was not that unusual, especially since the demise of the monasteries meant there were no monastic accommodation, guest houses available. Some of the places are old medieval pilgrimage, so the places that ceased to function as the hospitals that had sheltered people on pilgrimages in the Middle Ages, they carried on operating as places of hospitality and became inns, I suppose, is a sort of inn. In Canterbury, the Christchurch Priory had put up a massive inn where there was a dormitory with 100 beds in for pilgrims who are going to see St. Thomas's shrine. And there are a couple of other hospitals in the town which continued as well. Those became sorts of inns or places where you could get accommodation afterwards. But largely you're going to rely on the people you know. And this is why people keep in touch with their second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, so that they have a place to stay when they move away from home. They have not only the means to get information and a refuge, hospitality places, but they know they'll be safe there. They're under the roof of their kinsfolk. So I would have thought that inn is the obvious place to stay, but then your kinship networks and that is also something you're going to take advantage of. Now, the question of what's the experience of a visitor like visiting London, I think you said, wasn't it? I think if you came with modern expectations, London would have seemed very crowded, very smelly, and not that large, because the start of Elizabeth's reign, population of London was probably about 50 to 60,000, and by the end of her reign, it was about 200,000. A lot of those buildings are old buildings, virtually no new building, really. I mean, they get higher and higher, the buildings, as pressure grows. Queen Elizabeth doesn't allow any building to the west of London, so therefore there's this pressure for houses to get higher. We would have found it quite oppressive in the stink of so many people living in such proximity, and of course the houses being rat infested. What they would have thought, contemporaries visiting London, they would have been really struck by how large the place was, because for them, a city of 200,000 people was a metropolis. It's massive by comparison with the next cities, which might be places like Exeter with 8,000 or Bristol with somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. So our perceptions would have been very different from theirs. And of course, when it comes to the smells, they would have been used to all cities smelling that way. So it wouldn't have been such a shock to them. Not that they thought that there was no problem with the smell, and then they clearly did. And if you could get away from the smells of so many people living in proximity, that was considered a sign of gentility. And doctors who wanted to get a better clientele would often move their premises to try and avoid noisome smells, because, of course, that was associated with disease. But people accepted that cities did smell, and cities were where you could get work and you just had to compromise. So their impressions would have been of scale and bustle and wealth. Ours would be those of bustle, definitely, but a much smaller scale, and very claustrophobic, so many people living in such a small place.
Well, I know we would love to learn more about this topic. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, of course, I'm going to say you should all start with The Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England.
100%.
Which is, I've got 4 of them now. Elizabethan England is the yellow one, green, medieval, blue, Regency, and red is for Restoration. The set is there as a set that you should be able to understand our time much better by coming to terms with other times. But you can read the Elizabethan one by itself, because each one is designed to stand by itself and tell you what it's like if you really could go to these times. So they're on England or Britain in those times. I was very impressed by this book. It's called Plenty and Grace, Food and Drink in 16th Century Household by Mark Dawson. It's a minute look at what we can learn about the way of life in an aristocratic household by looking at the accounts for Willerton Hall in Nottinghamshire. And I learnt a lot from that book. To be precise, I got a lot of the answers from that book that I was asking myself and was struggling to find in other sources. So that detailed study of all the dimensions of a household, what you would have in a household, how people were decorating their household, what they spent their money on, when did they have breakfast and when they did not have breakfast, things like that. A lot of it's in that book, and I was very impressed by its scope. Another book I really think that anybody who picks it up will be impressed by, if you can get a copy. I think it's now available as a paperback because it became a very difficult book to get, is this, Before the Mast, Life and Death Aboard the Mary Rose. It's basically one of the volumes of the archaeology of the ship that sank in Henry VIII's reign. And although it's before Elizabeth's time, because it is such a time capsule of life in the 1540s, that it gives us a lot of indications for what we can expect life to be like for people in the early part of Elizabeth's reign, just 13, 14 years after the sinking. So those are the books I'd recommend going to first. But obviously, if you're interested in the politics of things, then there are other ways of getting that information.
We will link to these resources in the show notes for today's episode. Ian's book, The Time Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England, is available in That Shakespeare shop, which you can purchase on our website. And I believe Blackwell's has Before the Mast. At least they have that listed on their website. So I'll place a link to that in our show notes as well. So you can find all three of these books right from the show notes of today's episode. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Ian, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Is it going to be from Elizabethan England?
It does not. You can pick any book that you would like to take with you.
I find the most sophisticated fictional approach to history being Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. I read it when I was 18. And I was blown away by it. I was meant to be on my way to Spain at the time. I was just so mesmerized by the book. I just booked into a hotel and finished it overnight. I've never read it. I've never reread anything apart from the poems at the end of the book again. But what I really was struck by was how sophisticated his melding of real history and fiction was. And because I'm interested in the way that people write history and the way that history comes together, I would very much like to sit down uninterrupted and read through Dr. Zhivago from beginning to end once more.
How much fun. I'd almost be interested to ask you if you liked it as much the second go-round after you had it on
I haven't done it yet. I haven't had time to. I can't really. I'm writing 4 books at once at the moment, so I don't have the time or the leisure to just read a book for pleasure. If you spend 10 hours a day writing, you really don't want to read a book at the end.
Not much reading at that point, but I think it would be an excellent selection for your desert island choice. Absolutely. So you said you are currently writing. Is that what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Oh, well, I'm completely obsessed at the moment by a book called, this is literally what it says on the tin, The Rules for Writing History. I am writing the rule book that everybody, no matter who they are, however dignified and however well qualified, need to observe when they write history books. Because we've got a lot of primers for history, a lot of guides, and some of them are very good, but no one actually has laid down what the canons of history are. So what you should and shouldn't do when you write about the past. And what is the degree of latitude and flexibility? So it's a book that's obsessing me at the moment, and I'm almost at the end. I'm just finishing, well, not quite finishing, but we're in the last straight. So that's one thing. I'm writing a book with my wife about all the medieval pubs in England, which is great fun because we go off once a month to go and visit medieval pubs. And those that claim to be medieval, which aren't quite as historical as they claim to be, but it's great fun. I'm writing a history of England as it would have appeared to the people living in this house. I live in a very, very, very old house. The people have been living on this site for at least 1,300 years. And parts of the front wall of the building go back to the 13th century. So I'm writing a history of England as it would have appeared to the people living on this spot. So a national history, but with a single viewpoint. So some events, like the Wars of the Roses, simply don't matter. And others, like the murder of Archbishop Becket, were of enormous importance because one of the murderers came from here. So that's the third book I'm writing. I'm writing my A to Zs. So every time I did a time traveler's guide, I had 26 points, which I would include in the speech. So my A to Zs of English history. And they were always so popular, I thought, well, it makes sense to actually turn them into a book. I'm also doing that at the moment as well. So, four projects on the go at once.
It sounds like you have many great projects up your sleeve. And because we enjoyed Time Traveler's Guide so much, I'm sure that we'll look forward to seeing these come to life as well. Ian Mortimer, thank you so much for visiting with us today. It's a delight to get to talk with you. And I appreciate you taking us on this trip into Elizabethan London to get to see, hear, and discover what it would have been like when Shakespeare was living there. Thank you for visiting with us. I have really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
If you like the show today, be sure to let us know about it. Drop us a rating and review on the platform you're listening from today. Every rating and review that you list for our show helps other listeners discover our show. And as you know, we love connecting with fellow Shakespeareans. If you would like to see visual elements that go along with our show today, including woodcuts and portraits and paintings, as well as museum artifacts that coordinate with what we were talking about in the show today, then be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode. The show notes are not only where you can see bonus history that coordinates with the conversation, but it's also where we place links to the resources our guests recommend and links to the guests' websites so you can connect with the historians that you hear about on our show. To connect with Ian and see the resources that he recommends, visit CassidyCash.com/episode 274. That's CassidyCash.com/EP274. If you enjoy our show here each week and want to have a direct hand in supporting the work we do and have the opportunity to help produce our show, then consider becoming a patron of That Shakespeare Life. Patrons get access to over 150 additional episodes of our show, along with behind-the-scenes extras, sneak peeks at upcoming guests, and the chance to submit your own questions to be asked on the air, as well as an exclusive patrons-only discount code that gets you 20% off everything available in That Shakespeare shop, just to say thank you for supporting our show. Our patrons really do make That Shakespeare Life possible. If you would like to be a part of powering this podcast, then sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.